scholars agree. 10, 39, 51, 78. Every scholar agrees. Those are probably the four most important Federalist papers to know. So that leaves an extra one. So I just threw one. I picked from a number of candidates, number 65. What does number 65 deal with? Impeachment. So I thought that's going to be a timely topic. And let's take a look and see what. So Madison was the author of four of those, and Hamilton was the author of number 78. So I am wearing this is President's Day, so we need to remember that. And we are celebrating two presidents that everybody agrees are the two greatest presidents the United States ever had. George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. Which one comes first? I don't know. I have my opinion, but and I'll express that opinion but they were both great presidents. I used to play devil's advocate with my students and argue that it was George Washington. And they said, "How can you did this book on Abraham Lincoln? How in the world can you say it's George Washington?" And I would give them the argument that uh, he, if you don't have George Washington, you don't have a republic. You don't have a person who proved not just once that he could step away from great power, he did it twice. When he returned his commission as the commander of the Continental Army, he could have been king. His soldiers would have supported it, and a lot of people in the colonies would have supported it as well. But he didn't support it. He was a true Republican, small r, not large r. He believed in a republic, stepped away as the commander of the army, and then he's the president of the Constitutional Convention. If he doesn't approve of that product, it doesn't get ratified in the states. That's just all there is to it. So the fact that he put his name on that document as approving it was probably the difference in the long run for several states as to whether they ratified it or didn't ratify it. And then as president, he's the first president. He's the only president unanimously elected both times by the Electoral College. And some of the people that opposed the ratification said, we're good with Washington. We don't have any problem with Washington. But what happens when Schlossington becomes the president? Is he going to be as good as Washington? And what did Washington do? He established the two-term precedent. He said 2 terms and a position of great power is enough for anyone except Franklin D. Roosevelt. And then after Franklin, well, legally Trump can't do it, but that's because the Republicans after World War II, after Franklin Roosevelt's death, they are the ones that crafted that. Is it not the 25th, 22nd Amendment? I think I'll have to look it up. The 22nd Amendment, where a person was limited to 2 full terms, but actually, technically, up to 9 years, 9.5 years minus 1 day. So if you got through half the term minus 1 day, then you could be reelected in your own right 2 terms.
Oh, right. Oh, right.
So you
right.
gain power by being vice president, becoming president, as long as it was 1 day less than half the term, you could be elected twice. If it was 1 day more than half, you could only be reelected. You could only be elected once in your own name. So Lyndon Johnson, technically, had he not done a lot of other stupid things, technically could have been elected twice in his own name as president because Kennedy had served almost 3 years at that point. Well, actually, a little over 3 years. So that would have said you can fill out Kennedy's term, and then you could run for president twice after that, according to the amendment. So, and then Abraham Lincoln. So you don't have a republic. You don't have a United States to rescue and save if you don't have George Washington. On the other hand, it's Lincoln that guides us through the Civil War. And it's Lincoln that finds a way uh, to emancipate the slaves, although his concern was, okay, I'm using what John Quincy Adams said is a war power, that I only have this power when we're at war. What happens to emancipated slaves when the war ends? That's why he made the big push that you see in the movie Lincoln to get the 13th Amendment passed in the House of Representatives. Keeping in mind, this, and most people don't know, this was the second 13th Amendment. The original 13th Amendment, which was ratified by 5 or 6 states, including, to my regret, Ohio, was to establish slavery in perpetuity, and that amendment would be unrepealable. So to establish that was part of the compromise that Congress was trying to reach out for to bring the seceded states back into the Union. If your concern is slavery, which it really wasn't. It was, yeah, it was, but it wasn't. Then that's what that they hoped would say, okay, we're protecting slavery. We can't repeal it. They're your slaves forever and ever. And so, but fortunately, it never reached the bar of 3/4 of the states and never became an amendment to the Constitution. So our second 13th Amendment was the good one. So what did George Washington have? Well, he had something called virtue that the founders paid a lot of attention to. And here's Baron de Montesquieu's definition of virtue. In the Spirit of Laws, that was his famous book that the founders did use. Montesquieu defines political virtue as the love of one's country, its laws, and equality, functioning as the driving principle of republican governments. It is not a moral or Christian virtue, but a political, civic dedication to prioritizing the common good over personal interest. Common good over personal interest. Washington lived that out. Lincoln lived that out. And just as a little aside, only one president ever met both George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. Only one rubbed shoulders with both of them. And that was John Quincy Adams. So at some point, he, of course, worked for his father during the Revolution and knew George Washington personally. And he's up to Andrew Johnson being elected to the Senate, was the only former president to serve in Congress. He served in the House of Representatives for 13, 14 years. And he actually died in the House of Representatives after trying to object, one more objection to working with not allowing petitions against slavery to be heard in the House of Representatives. It was called the gag rule. And the gag rule got worse and worse and worse, but slowly as the northern states, which were more populous, gained in population, they eventually overcame the 3/5 benefit that the southern states got for people who couldn't vote. So every black slave who didn't have a hope for ever voting counted as 3/5 of a vote, which gave the southern states overrepresentation. And it took a long time for the population of the North to reach the bar where the South knew that they weren't going to be able to control the government, all three branches of the government, any longer. And Lincoln realized that. So that's setting stuff up. So let me go to the first slide here. And I need to do an addendum to my previous session because Betsy got an email, which I thought was very appropriate. What about the Iroquois Confederation? And that was a very valid comment. What about the Iroquois Confederation? Did it have any impact on the Constitutional Convention? I personally think that's very hard to know. But let's see, Haudenosaunee are what the Iroquois League actually called itself. and it consisted of the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and Tuscarora tribes. Now, there's a very wonderful brochure from the National Museum of the American Indian. And I'm thinking, why in the world would they give that the title for the premier indigenous peoples or native tribes? But that's the way it is. And they have like a 24-page booklet. And who are the Haudenosaunee? And which means people who build a house. So the Mohawk means people of the flint. Oneida, people of the standing stone. Onondaga, people of the hills. Cayuga, people of the great swamp. I can guess that they're probably Seneca, people of the great hill. And Tuscarora, which means shirt-wearing people. So, but their government had equivalents. The Haudenosaunee Grand Council and Clan Mothers was like the United States government. The Onondaga Nation was the president and executive. The Mohawk and Seneca, the elder brothers of the Confederacy, the U.S. Senate. The Oneida and Cayuga, the younger brothers of the Confederacy, the House of Representatives. And Clan Mothers and Women's Council was equivalent to the Supreme Court, the judicial branch. So it is remarkable. It has that, and we should acknowledge that. Benjamin Franklin certainly knew about. He knew the structure of that government. Thomas Jefferson, being the inquisitive person, he knew the structure of that government. But I put an asterisk beside Thomas Jefferson because Thomas Jefferson was in Europe as our ambassador to France. So he played no direct role in the Constitutional Convention. So you've got to keep him up. What his thoughts were about that, we don't know. But it also is true that James Madison, who was the architect of the Virginia Plan, which what became the framework of our government, did have consultations with the Oneida. So James Madison knew the Oneida. He knew the Iroquois Confederation structure. He knew how it worked. He could see the checks and balances that were built into it. Did it influence his design? I have no idea. But it's out there. He knew about it. He was aware of it. So now let's turn to what we're going through tonight is ratification. So if you want to pick up a book and don't mind a little bit of link, Ratification, The People Debate the Constitution, 1787-1788 by Pauline Maier is a superb book. Pauline is just a terrific historian and well worth reading to understand all the various battles. We'll talk about some of the battles, but all the conflicts that went along. Also, this is my favorite copy of the Federalist Papers, and the reason is because it has a brilliant introduction by Charles Kessler. Now, for those of you with vision issues, not going to want this book, but it does have all the Federalist Papers, and it has the Declaration of Independence, but the introduction is brilliant in helping you to understand, what were they thinking? What were they trying to accomplish? Well worth knowing. So the new Constitution required 9 states to ratify it to go into effect. I say that was technically illegal, and it was technically illegal. Why? Because the Articles of Confederation, which was the existing lousy government that they were operating under, required a unanimous 13 state. They all, in their Congress, they didn't vote by congressmen. They voted by states. Each state had one vote regardless of its population. So obviously, the more populous states didn't like that. The less populous states did like that because they got more influence than they actually deserved. But technically, all 13 of the states had to ratify, had to agree that to make this type of change, and they didn't. So in the Constitution, you look at the ratification clauses, as soon as 9 states ratify, it goes into effect.
Sorry, understand. So
So is that okay?
Yes, ask a question. I'll try and repeat the question so that the Zoom audience can hear it.
So what you have up here and what you just said was that the Constitution said 9 states
Right.
had to
The
ratify it, but
Confederation.
you're telling us that in fact, legally it has to be 13. I'm not sure.
According to the old government still in existence,
Oh, God.
it had to be 13. So the question was, why the difference in the number of states? Under the Articles of Confederation, any change to the Articles of Confederation in a new government would be a change to the Articles of Confederation, required all 13 states to agree. Here's the bottom line. They never agreed unanimously on anything. So this was a compromise, but technically an illegal compromise. And the Anti-Federalists said so. You can't do that. You don't have all 13, and they just ignored it. But 9 states ratifying without the most populous states, the large states of Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and New York, and all 4 of them had to be there. Without all 4 of them ratifying, the new government was not going to work, and they all knew it. Hence, some of the most difficult struggles we're going to talk about are going to be, surprisingly, in Massachusetts, the cradle of the revolution. Huge battle was fought there. And people like Sam Adams, we think he is the architect, seriously, he's the architect of the revolution in Massachusetts. You don't have Sam Adams, you don't have the Boston Tea Party, you don't have the committees of correspondence, you don't have a lot of, he's the strategist behind that. He preferred to lay low and not let anybody know what he was actually doing, but the British were well aware of who was the architect of that. So the country divides into Federalists and Anti-Federalists. And I put as the Federalists staged an incredible coup by taking the title of Federalist, because Federalist in 1787 meant states' rights. These clearly were nationalists. So Alexander Hamilton, so of the Alex, Jim, and John, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Jay are the principal authors of the Federalist Papers. National was the term. They should have called themselves national. But Alexander Hamilton, and it was a brilliant stroke, because now what are the people opposing his title of Fed? There are people who really want states' rights. What are they going to call themselves? You don't want to be anti anything. So here they are, the anti-federalists, anti what they really represent. And so he stole a march on them. It was a brilliant stroke. And so we, yeah, that is one of the major things that puts them behind the 8 ball to begin with, that they had to take a name that technically was opposed to what they actually represented. So who were the Federalists? Well, they were popular with merchants and city dwellers. They believed that a strong government was needed to prevent anarchy, and they were absolutely correct in that. They had a number of issues, a number of quasi-revolutions, Shays's rebellion being the most notable, but there were other ones as well. And we'll even have a rebellion after the Constitution is ratified called the Whiskey Rebellion. So you will see that this economy, the economic problems that still exist while the new government's gaining its feet, occupy a lot of time. Strong government would protect us from foreign powers, check. Like Britain, who wouldn't mind having us as colonies again, which is kind of what the War of 1812 was all about. Spain, who didn't like us. France, who was our ally, but we weren't actually treating them all that well. So we will go into a period of time after in John Adams' administration where we were actually in an undeclared war with France for 3 years. And it would have been very, very popular to declare war, and then it would have been economic suicide. John Adams, initially he didn't get it, but he figured it out, and he says, "No, we got to stay the course. We need to resolve our issues without going to war." And he knew that that was very unpopular, and he did it anyway. And it cost him the election of 1800. But he said, if you want to put one thing on my gravestone, put something to effect, he put his country first. And that was absolutely true. The greatest accusation that the Anti-Federalists had was there's no Bill of Rights. All of the gains of the revolution are in jeopardy. So the Federalists compromised and said, okay, we'll resolve that. We promise that one of the first things, if not the first thing that we do in the new Congress, is to create a Bill of Rights to protect those things that are so very important to you. Anti-Federalists. So you're going to see an urban-rural thing here. Urban-rural, just as we're looking at the Democratic Republican breakdown today, claimed they were popular with farmers and laborers. They claimed the Constitution was not legal. They were right. They believed that the Constitution was a power grab from the states. It had to be to work. So yes, they were right again. No Bill of Rights. And you see that from some very famous people. No Bill of Rights, including Samuel Adams, Sam Adams, the architect of the revolution in Massachusetts. He's saying, no Bill of Rights. I can't support that. So each side had what I call heavy hitters. The Federalists had George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, James Wilson, John Jay, John Adams, and Gouverneur Morris. Everybody wants to call him Governor Morris, but that is not his name. It's Gouverneur Morris because he was I think he was an only child. And the Gouverneur family, his mom was Sarah Gouverneur, and the Gouverneur name was not going to be carried on. So she named him his first name for her surname, Sarah Gouverneur, and it becomes Gouverneur Morris. The authors of the Federalists used a pen name, Publius. We'll come back to Publius Valerius Publicola. And we had run across him in our previous session, and that's because the founding generation really, really was in love with the Romans and the Roman Republic, particularly the Roman Republic. And who was more influential in creating the Rome? He was a consul who overthrew the Tarquinian king and was one of the first two consuls of the Roman Republic, and he was a consul 2 or 3 times after that. He stayed to implement the laws that he was trying to create. We'll come back to him. Now, that doesn't say that the Anti-Federalists had their Romans too, by the way. So we'll talk about Cato, the great orator, and among others, Brutus, who assassinated Julius Caesar and ended a dictatorship. So they had George Mason, who wrote the Virginia Declaration of Rights, Edmund Randolph, the governor of Virginia, Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death. What did he say? I smell a rat in Philadelphia, tending towards monarchy. So Richard Henry Lee and Sam Adams. Anti-Federalists used several pseudonyms, with Brutus, likely Robert Yates being the most prominent and influential. Other common pen names were Cato, Sentinel, the Federal Farmer, and one that nobody knew, the Columbian Patriot. Nobody knew it was a woman writing. Mercy Otis Warren she took the pen name, a Columbian Patriot, so no one would realize it was a woman writing. And she was a powerful writer. Okay, Anti-Federalists were not nearly as organized in their opposition, but they could be eloquent and persuasive in their arguments, aka Mercy Otis Warren. Key states, New York and Virginia. The large states of Pennsylvania and Massachusetts ratified relatively quickly. However, I should put an asterisk there. Pennsylvania was easy. This is the home of Ben Franklin, Wilson, and a number of it was a piece of cake in Pennsylvania. quick without much controversy. It was very hard fought in Massachusetts. So let's take a look at the order of ratification here. Delaware. So if you remember the state quarters when they first came out, something like first state was Delaware's quarter, something like that. And that's because they were the first one to ratify. Pennsylvania, December the 12th, 1787. New Jersey, December the 18th, 1787. Georgia, January 2nd, 1788. Connecticut, January the 9th, 1788. Massachusetts, February the 6th. Notice there's quite a distance between February and when the first ones ratify. And that the longer the time, the more difficult ratification generally is going to be. Maryland, April the 28th. South Carolina, May the 23rd, 1788. New Hampshire, the ninth state, on June the 21st, 1788. But then there's Virginia and New York. And South Carolina is going to be way behind it on November 21st, 1789. And Rhode Island, after the United States is in existence, I used to tell my students, Rhode Island, and was May the 29th, 1790.
What was holding Rhode Island up so much? Because they were like way out, and they're completely surrounded by
Yeah,
Massachusetts and Connecticut.
they marched to the beat of a different drummer in Rhode Island. You will note that Rhode Island wasn't even represented at the Constitutional Convention. They stayed completely out of it. You guys go do your thing. And then all of a sudden it dawned on them, we're being left in the dust. And the Bill of Rights, I think, had been proposed by that time, so they could make the argument that, well, yeah, the Bill of Rights, it's okay. We can ratify now. And in case of North Carolina ratified one of the few states with the proviso that for that to be concluded, there must be a Bill of Rights. So if you take a look at when the Bill of Rights was formally ratified, I think North Carolina trailed that ratification, but I could be wrong on that. So the ratification in Massachusetts, the divide. The 364 delegate convention was closely divided. Anti-Federalists, fearing a strong central government, were led by critics like Sam Adams and initially John Hancock, who, of course, on the Declaration of Independence is the one that puts the big signature on it, so that even the dim-witted, nearly blind King of England can see that signature. Plus, he had a huge ego. John Hancock did. The turning point. To win, Federalists needed to sway key figures. They brokered a deal with John Hancock, proposing that the state ratify the Constitution as it is, but immediately recommend the Bill of Rights to Congress. In other words, to take it from as it is to as it should be. And that was successful. Now, the final vote was 187 to 168. You change 10 people, 10 votes, and it fails. That's all, just 10. And it goes the other direction. And the birthplace of the American Revolution becomes a state that doesn't ratify the Constitution. The ratification fight in Virginia, even closer. The factions, Federalists sought a stronger central government to unite the states, while Anti-Federalists feared the Constitution created an overbearing tyranny that threatened individual liberties. The debate featured Patrick Henry and George Mason opposing ratification, while James Madison, Edmund Randolph, and John Marshall argued in favor of it. Now, there's a little thing I can't put in here, because when we start talking about the Federalist Papers, these 85 newspaper articles, how many of those newspaper articles made it down to Virginia to sway the debate there? Almost none. Maybe one or two. One or two of the 85 papers, except for this quirk that Alexander Hamilton has them put in book form before they're even completely published in the New York newspapers. And 50 of those books belong to John Marshall. So Did he distribute them? Did they have any effect on the Virginia ratification? We just don't know, but we know that at least 50 copies of the book form of Federalist Papers made it down there and were read, even though the newspaper articles were not. So, there's real quirk there. So, Virginia's approval was considered vital for the new government's legitimacy. The compromise involved accepting the Constitution while recommending a Bill of Rights to address anti-federalist concerns. The close victory, now the vote was 89 to 79. And so 89, yeah, 10 people changed their vote. Or is it six? No, it's six.
Six.
The change, so you go from 10 in Massachusetts to 6 in Virginia, and the western counties of Virginia, which would in the future become West Virginia, played a pivotal, even though they disliked the rich elites, but they were also some slaveholders. So they were conflicted, and the Western Virginians were conflicted, but the Western counties play a pivotal and ultimately decisive role in the narrow ratification in June 1788. Although the region was heavily populated by anti-federalists who feared the strong central government, key delegates from the Shenandoah Valley and Western districts shifted their support to the Federalists, ensuring that Virginia ratified. So now New York is the only big state out there, and they're paying attention to what's going on in Virginia. And now all of a sudden, not only is Rhode Island going to be left in the dust, New York could be left in the dust as well. So the conflict there, the anti-federalists feared the strong central government would destroy state sovereignty and individual rights. And to a small extent, that's true because the state of New York would no longer be the almighty state of New York to the citizens of New York. It would have to defer to the national government on some things, not all things, and not a lot of things at that time. But the Federalists argue the robust union was necessary for economic growth and stability. The numbers, early in 1788, it was estimated that 2/3 of the convention delegates were initially opposed to ratification, and they were overconfident. And their leader was a guy by the name of Melancton Smith. My students used to love that name, Melancton. Say that, Melancton Smith. The turning point was news of ratification by Virginia. News of ratification by New Hampshire and Virginia forced New York to either join the new union or face isolation. The final vote was 30 to 27. Two people, including Melancton Smith. He was the leader of the anti-federalists, shifted his position, and he was the key vote that made it possible. Once he did, then one other followed in line, and by two voters, the switch became reality. So what did the Federalists do? They agreed to support a Bill of Rights, and they listed them out, 25 rights and 31 amendments that they proposed in their ratification. And that would form the basis as James Madison collected the suggestions from the states as to what needs to be in the Bill of Rights. There were 100 suggestions from the 13 states, and 31 of those were from New York. And eventually it coalesced down into 12. Even though we call it the Bill of Rights, the initial was 12 suggested amendments. Number 1 and number 2 were not ratified in 1791. And number 1 was number 2, because number one wasn't ratified, and number 2, about 200 years later, was ratified. So the initial number 1 or number 2 became the 27th Amendment to the Constitution, and it was very simple, that Congress couldn't raise its salaries and benefit from them in the same session of Congress. In other words, there had to be you could raise your pay, but you couldn't benefit from it till after the next election. And that because there was no time limit that was put on either one of the first two amendments that weren't ratified, a student studying that, writing a paper on it, got a C in Texas, of all places, and then took it to heart that he thought the paper was pretty good, should have been an A paper. And the professor, it was a TA that gave him the C. And so he goes to the professor and she says, well, I can't undermine my TAs. So the C stands without, and he had a pretty good argument. So he spent years writing thousands of letters to state legislators, and slowly, state after state after state, finally got the requisite 3/4. And then, oh, who was it? I'm trying to think of the Republican Speaker of the House from Cincinnati.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think. He was the one that cried about, who was the weepy one. Boehner, John Boehner, right.
Okay.
And John Boehner took credit for it. The student was apoplectic, hated politicians as a result. At any rate, so, and by the way, New York City always was eccentric. It threatened to secede from the state of New York if they didn't ratify the Constitution. Just as in the Civil War, New York City was a southern-leaning city because of business. They played with the idea of seceding from New York at that time as well. But Lincoln thought, who's got the troops, boys? This is not the capital of the United States, which really is in danger. Yeah, you're well in the north. So to influence the citizens of New York, Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay published 85 essays, later gathered together by Hamilton and published as a 2-volume set, arguing in favor of ratifying the Constitution, trying to explain in brilliant detail. I mean, it's an incredibly difficult read, and in some cases to go through all of them. So originally it was going to be just John Jay and Alexander Hamilton. John Jay was a very noted lawyer. He would later be the Chief Justice of the United States, but he was governor of New York. This was a guy and he was perfectly capable of writing them, but he got ill. So you see Federalist 2, 3, 4, 5, and 64. Those are the 5 that John Jay would write. So now Alexander Hamilton is casting around for who can help me do this? And it so happens that James Madison was in New York as a member of Continental Congress, so he was there as a delegate. And so Hamilton lobbies him and said, I really need you. After all, you did create the framework of the Constitution is your baby. You did all the research. And then when you look at, well, what exactly was James Madison, what was his occupation? Politician. That's it. It's not like George Washington, who was a farmer, who was a surveyor, who was in a way, who was an officer in the military, constantly seeking to become part of the British Army, by the way, but nevertheless, there you go. James Madison, politics. And the only office he will be Secretary of State, which is why you have the Marbury versus Madison that becomes a definitive Supreme Court case. And we'll learn how Alexander Hamilton anticipated that in Federalist 78. So of the articles, Madison about 50, Hamilton about 50, Madison about 30, and the reason I say about is I'm trying to think that I remember to write these down, which ones nobody can tell. Oh yeah, Federalist numbers 55 to 58 and 62 and 63. The author cannot be definitively determined no matter how you analyze it. So both claimed all of them. So Madison said, those were all mine. Hamilton said, those were all mine. Okay, whatever. So who was Publius? This long dead Roman. And in fact, in many ways, the real author of the Federalist Papers was Publius. According to Plutarch's Parallel Lives, he was one of the founders and saviors of the Roman Republic. Unlike Solon, the great Greek lawgiver, who left Athens and Greece for 10 years and just, okay, let's see how things go, Publius stayed in Rome and attempted to implement what he thought to improve the city's primitive republican laws, to impart his own spirit of moderation, justice, and wisdom. And since the founding generation was really into all things Roman, who could be a more trusted guide, interpreter, and defender of the new Constitution than Publius himself? So Publius easily trumped the pseudonyms of Cato and Brutus used by the Anti-Federalists. What is so amazing is how similarly Hamilton and Madison wrote. They did not consult each other. So they were rolling these things out 1 or 2 a week, sometimes 3 or 4 a week, without this, they knew what the general subjects were going to be, but they didn't consult with each other on the language in them. And it's almost, it is tremendously amazing without this consultation that Madison would say things exactly the way that Hamilton wanted them said, and vice versa. So in a sense, like I said, Publius really was the author of the Federalist Papers. So, as I said before, they were a series of 85 essays published in New York newspapers, primarily the Independent Journal and the New York Packet, between October 1787 and August 1788. And the 2-book version came out prior to the last newspaper article being published. And the fact that made it down to Virginia, well, we don't know. Very few were published in other states, so their ultimate influence is unknown, except that, when you ask Thomas Jefferson later in his life, what is the best explanation of our government and how it should work? Thomas Jefferson immediately said, written by his enemy, because Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson become real enemies in the process of this ratification. And James Madison starts as an ally of Alexander Hamilton and ultimately does a complete turnaround and becomes a loyalist to Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson, when I think of Mount Rushmore, I think of who would I put up there? Would I take anybody off? Jefferson was such a backstabber to Washington and saying, George, I didn't have anything to do with that. And Washington knew that he did. So he eventually just cuts off all communication and turns his back. But then you do have Thomas Jefferson, the author, the lead author, and I say lead author because Benjamin Franklin and John Adams made some very critical changes. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Self-evident was Benjamin Franklin's language. Thomas Jefferson originally said sacred and unalienable was what he replaced. And that was throughout. Benjamin Franklin and John Adams really played a bigger role in the creation of the final Declaration of Independence than Thomas Jefferson wanted to give them credit for. He wanted to give them no credit. And in fact, Thomas Jefferson saved his Declaration of Independence and sent copies to all his friends and say, don't you think this one is better than what the Continental Congress passed? Don't you agree with me that they shouldn't have made a single editorial change?
But don't you think this, I find a certain solace in that because they all contributed to it in their own way.
Yeah.
And they were all normal and had egos, just the way you deal with
huge
egos
today. Yeah.
And there had to be compromise.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not as if one person wrote it and insisted on it, and that would
Right.
have been a very different thing.
Oh, no. Continental Congress took a real editing pen to the Declaration of Independence, and they clearly improved it. Other than Thomas Jefferson was concerned and appalled by the fact that he wanted to put something anti-slavery in to the Declaration of Independence, even though he's a slaveholder. I mean, so on Mount Rushmore, I'd probably keep Jefferson. I would definitely keep Washington and Lincoln, but they've got the wrong Roosevelt.
Yeah, yeah.
That's the one I would switch, and I would feel really good about it because, okay, Teddy Roosevelt, you were pretty important, but you were a pompous ass a lot of the times, and you were very self-assured. You didn't listen to what other people were saying often, and in some ways, trumpeting American power, it was almost an early version of America First. The Great White Fleet that he sent around the, okay, what kind of message are we sending there? Roosevelt, Teddy did not insist on protecting African American civil servants. So that was an issue. But then again, he did have Booker T. Washington to the White House. So it's this mixed bag. With Franklin Roosevelt, much less of a mixed bag. Depression, World War II. I mean, clearly the challenges that Franklin Roosevelt faced were much deeper and more difficult than those of Teddy Roosevelt. So that sets the stage for what we're going to be doing in the future here. How are we doing timeline? We're doing pretty good. So in the future, this is going to be a little more difficult. I think we can do it. But what I used to do is take my advanced placement government classes and I would read aloud to them. And all of you, you can download the copies of the Federalist Papers in question at any time. They're on the clallamdems.org website. And so, but I want to read through those and then look at what's the decision-making process here. So in Federalist 10, factions. They knew factions were bad, as George Herbert Walker Bush would say. Not gonna do it. But how to create a government that doesn't allow factions to overrun the government and destroy it. That's the critical question of Federalist number 10. And there are a lot of decision-making points. If you read it, okay, would this work? No, this doesn't solve it. But let's try this idea. What do you think? What about small republics? That's not going to work. We have tremendous proof the small republics can't cut the mustard. But what about an enormous republic, the size of which had never been seen before? That becomes the saving grace, that it's so large, you can't create a majority faction. Or theoretically, it's much more difficult to create. But now we're seeing that majority factions indeed can be created when you have a mechanism of rapid communication with people and the dispensing of misinformation, disinformation, untruths that people, in many cases uneducated, just wholeheartedly accept. So we're going to have to look, even the thinking of Madison, we're going to have to take a look at and say, does this really solve the issues that we've got facing us? Federalist 39, what kind of republic? Because they're answering the anti-federalists in this case. Is it a federal or is it a national republic? And yep, I've got the right, had to make sure I got the right slide up because I tend to forget moving slides. And what Madison is going to show us is that it's mixed. In some areas, it's a national government. In other areas, the states are sovereign. It all depends on what we're talking about here. And there are many places where the state sovereignty is left intact. Then Federalist 51. And Wayne promises me what we're going to do is I used to make an bonus points opportunity for my advanced placement. I said, bring in a marble cake for bonus points or marble cupcakes, because what we're going to see Madison argues is that we have a layer cake. It's national, clear part of the cake, state, another clear definition. You got the frosting in between, and then the local, and they don't intermix. And yet, a very important political scientist who was writing in 1960, I had to track down, Morton Grodsons, said, "You guys," he was explaining this to Kennedy, "you got this all mixed up. This is not a layer cake, it's a marble cake because the national reaches down to the local reaches into the state reaches into the national, and trying to figure out exactly, is this a national responsibility? Is this a state responsibility? Is this a local responsibility? We can't figure it out anymore. We know, like a garbage, they call, what did they had a euphemism for it. They didn't call them garbage collectors. It was a
Trash man?
no. They found a term that skated all across any of our prejudices. A refuse collector or something like that. That's the idea where it isn't pejorative, because we think trash man and you don't have good thoughts about that. But so Morton Grodson showed, well, he's impacted by federal regulations, he's impacted by state regulations, and he's impacted by local laws. It's all of those. It's not any, you can't separate out what's the national, the state, and the local responsibilities in this refuse collector. Federal 65, that's my choice. There are other ones I could have put in, but impeachment seems to be relevant. And basically what Madison is talking about is how the Senate is supposed to work. And so that in that how the Senate is supposed to work is a discussion of impeachment. And of course, impeachment was always a political process. And that's its Achilles heel. That it's not a legal process, it's a political process. So no president has ever, I liked it when, I'm trying to think, Pam Bondi was talking about, you tried to impeach Trump, blah, 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 blah. No, you got it wrong, Pam. They did impeach Trump, but the Senate didn't convict him. There's two pieces to this puzzle, Pam. And I'm not a lawyer, and I shouldn't have to be telling you how the law actually works, Pam. But that's where we get this first discussion of how's it supposed to work? What's supposed to happen? What's the likelihood of removing somebody from office? And Thomas Jefferson did try to remove a justice from the Supreme Court and failed. And that was so important in keeping the separation of powers valid and not making the office of a justice of the Supreme Court only solely political. Now, that justice should have kept his mouth shut, but that's neither here nor there. He was not careful, and he was telling juries how they should vote, what verdict they should reach. No, that's a big mistake. Yeah. But the only reason you didn't like it, Thomas Jefferson, was because he was opposing you and what you wanted to have happen. And that's why Jefferson worked so hard to impeach him. Yes.
So theoretically, you can impeach a justice of the Supreme Court?
Yes. Absolutely.
Well, but not by the president.
Yeah. It has to be Congress. It has to be the House of Representatives.
Yeah, the same process.
Yes. It's exactly the same process. Yes. Right. And some federal judges have been removed, maybe 10 in the history of our country. I don't think it's much more than that.
Can you impeach a member of Congress?
No, only the House can deal with members of the House, and only the Senate can deal with members of the Senate. So, and I don't know if anybody's ever actually been removed. They are criticized. They are.
What's his name?
Joseph McCarthy.
Santos.
They can be censured, right?
They can be censured. And there's a couple of other things they can.
With Santos, didn't he?
Oh, the House did vote to remove him. Yes.
And then he ran again.
Yep. Lost.
Yeah,
But yeah,
Trump endorsed him.
but that's one of the very, very rare members to be impeached and to be to be removed from the body of the House. I don't know if you call that impeachment necessarily, because there was no trial, there was no trial held.
yeah,
It's just a vote of Congress to say, we determine who can be a member of this chamber, and you were awful.
And it's a fairly high bar
It is a
because
fairly-
otherwise a simple majority could just keep
Right.
voting the
Right.
other party out of power.
that's true.
So, and then finally, Federalist number, we'll take a look at Federalist 78, which we do a deep dive into the judicial branch, and it is Alexander Hamilton. Because if you look at the Constitution, it doesn't say who can declare laws unconstitutional. It's silent. But Alexander Hamilton says, well, they are the highest court in the land, so it would make sense that this ought to be the group that would determine whether a state law or a federal law is unconstitutional. And so that's the reason. John Marshall was well aware of Federalist 78 when he was dealing with the case of Marbury versus Madison. And we will come back to why Marbury versus Madison was so important and how Jefferson tricked, or how Marshall tricked Jefferson. And because Jefferson thought he had him, he says he can't rule. Either way he rules, he loses. Well, Jefferson was wrong on that. So Marshall declared the law unconstitutional. He declared the law unconstitutional, but that Marbury should have gotten the position that Jefferson denied him. But since the law that gave him the position was unconstitutional, Marbury, you lose. Jefferson, you lose. Jefferson was beside himself with anger over that. So now we're to the point where if anybody would have any questions you would like to add, ask, talk about. John, right?
Yeah, I think I have maybe the timeline on my facts wrong, but didn't, to help the ratification, I think it was Hamilton, decide on the placement of the national capital in the swampland on the Potomac?
That was actually later.
Okay, all right.
That was a deal brokered by Jefferson. Say again?
Repeat the question.
Oh, the question was, John, what was the question? Where the capital was to be located. Was that part of the deal? Only later, only after, because it started out, the capital was in New York, and then it was moved to Philadelphia. And the Pennsylvanians thought, once we get it to Philadelphia, it's never going to go from Philadelphia. This is the place where the Constitution was written. This is where the Declaration of Independence, it must be Philadelphia. And that's when the deal for Hamilton to get his treasury bill that he wanted to get passed, that's when they brokered that deal that it would be, it turns out, some of George Washington's property.
So it would be wise for us to read Federalist 10 before next week.
It's a good idea. Do some highlighting, because I'd like to see some discussion. I'm going to try and use that board over there, see if I can't use a marker to write down, okay, what's the decision that's being made here? What's the question? Either way, what's the decision? And walk Federalist 10 through its rather complicated series of decisions as to why we want a large republic and why it's the solution.
Tom, would you invite the Zoom crowd to come in person for that?
100%. I'd love to have an ongoing conversation. And because we always used to have great fun talking through it, and me sometimes asking silly questions of them to get them to think, well, what about this? And what aren't they taking into consideration? And that kind of wraps around, Alexis de Tocqueville had a part of what he wrote called The Omnipotence of the Majority, and how Tocqueville said, there's no way around this. And that's essentially what they're asking about. How do you deal with the omnipotence of the majority? And Madison does not come up with a good answer for that. But the answer that worked for African Americans was the court system. You can't depend on anything else, and you can't really depend on the courts, but that's your only safe, workable mechanism to accomplish what you're trying to accomplish, and that worked.
Well, it's almost what's saving us today.
It is federal judges acting like judges.
Please repeat the questions.
Okay, our last question was, help me out here.
Would you invite the online people? And you said yes, but they didn't know what they just,
Oh, what I'm inviting you to do is come here in person if you can.
they can,
So that you can participate, because we're going to go up and start reading lines and transposing them and saying, okay, here's large republic, small republic. Oh, to prevent factions from forming, can we tell people what they have to think? Or so do you have propaganda? I mean, he really goes through a quite careful consideration. Well, we can't eliminate liberty because that's what we're trying to protect. But then you got these crazy ideas that are coming up. What do you do to refute them?
It's the same thing
Yeah,
today.
and that's why Federalist 10 was important and is even more important today. Are there any online questions in the chat box?
When is the next time?
Oh, next session is next Monday, a week from today, 6 o'clock.
There are no extra questions in the chat.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. Oh, question. Okay.
Benjamin Franklin is pretty relevant to the Federalist Papers and everything. Did he ever think about running for president, or did people?
He was
think
too old.
did? He was too old.
He was 80 at the time of the Constitutional Convention. He had gout. He had a lot of serious health issues. So, and in fact, yeah, he was the oldest at 80, and he lived to be 90 something, but he had serious health problems. They actually, in his last few years, they carried his slaves carried him around town to get him from one place to another. I don't think they were indentured servants, because there was slavery in Pennsylvania, but Pennsylvania was one of the first states to eliminate. So they could have been, paid servants, but that's how he got around. So interesting, totally interesting person. Dr. Franklin. Yes, sir.
I'm just wondering if the phrase you were searching for a while back was a rag and bone man.
No, I've never even heard that.
Repeat what did he say?
Oh, the question was, I was casting around trying to figure out what a refuse, what was a polite name for a refuse collector other than garbage man, trash man, and you came up, what was the term you came up with?
A rag and bone man, and that was the valuable trash worth collecting in the old days.
Okay, a rag and bone man.
British call him dust.
Yeah, that's better. But he had he had another term, and I'll just go to the book as soon as I get home and look at it. Oh yeah, it was that. But
You'll tell us next week.
yeah, I will. I will tell you next week what the operative word. Yes.
I really like the idea that you presented that was really part of what happening. And that was the choice of words. Words are very important. Right now, I'm fighting fluoride in the water. And I was awake this morning thinking, fluoridation is malfeasance. Fluoridation is malpractice. Those things I think those are powerful synonyms for it.
The question was, do words matter? And the answer is yes, they matter a lot, because you don't want to offend people. And sometimes what you're looking for is precision. So if you talk about fluoride or fluoridation, that means something specific, and you don't want to get the wrong word in there and mislead the public what you're trying to accomplish.
Thank you, Tom.
Okay, thanks, everybody. Sure.
There's a cloud conservation district election coming
Gotta
up.
be careful you don't trip.
One more day to ask for a ballot to be mailed to you. So if anybody wants to do that, take one of these and you can get a ballot.
I just wish every American high school student had Dr. Pete as a teacher.
I
And
did.
and if we did, imagine what kind of country we would have, how much better informed country, so
Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you so much, John.
One more day.
I'd also like to say tomorrow at noon at Asia Buffet, we get together just to chat with each other and have a wonderful lunch. So if any of you would care to join us, that would be wonderful.
I can. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry.
Where is Asian Buffet?
Up by the Harbor Freight, that shopping complex off of Del Guzzi Drive or,
Right,
yeah,
So do
east end of town.
east end of town.
Just past McDonald's and T-Mobile up on the hill.
AutoZone, the AutoZone store is there. You go up to the top and that's where the Asian buffet is.
Also tomorrow,
What's that?
tomorrow Chinese streets.
Oh, that'll be great.
My lawsuit.
Thank
Storm ride. But that was great fun.
you. Well, thank you.